Hello everybody, it's Taz101 Saga. This is going to be a comparison video between the Lee-Enfield No4 MkI, which is on your left, and the German Mauser K98K rifle, which is on your right. This video is for anybody who generally wants to know more about each of the rifles, or anyone who wants to find out which may have had the edge over the other back in the Second World War. This will be from a World War II kind of perspective. It's not going to be advising you which is the better rifle to buy in the present day. That's not what this is about. These rifles are both new specs. I just thought I'd get that out of the way and have certificates for both. So going on to the intro, the rifle you see on your left is my 1942 Savage made Lee-Enfield No4 MkI Star. The Star, it has some of the simplified features, and the rifle you see on the right is my Mauser Oberndorf made 1937 dated Mauser 98k, and it has all the correct features for its year of manufacture, and it's in great condition. Both are in excellent condition, the Lee-Enfield being in slightly better nick than the Mauser. So first thing I'll talk about really is a little introduction to both rifles. Now the rifle on the left, obviously you see the Lee-Enfield No4 MkI Star. It was basically an upgrade which entered official service in 1941 with branches of the British military. The earlier SMLE, or the short magazine Lee-Enfield No4 Mark III and Mark III Star, No1 Mark III Star, sorry, that was also in use in the Second World War, but it was officially replaced in 1941 by this rifle, although both were used. So the No4 basically came about in 1939 and it was officially adopted in 41. The SMLE went out of official service in 40 and 41. The rifle on the right, the Mauser K98K, it was basically a shortened down version of the World War I era Gewehr 98, which had a much longer barrel, a straight bolt handle and some different sights, and a different sling mounting system. It's designated as a carbine. The first K is the Karabiner, the latter K being K for kurz, which in German means short or shorter, as it has a shorter barrel. Both rifles were used extensively as a standard issue by both the British and the British for the Lee-Enfield and the Germans for the Mauser. The Mauser entered service in 1935 and was eventually put out of use in 1945 when they were all turned in and captured by invading armies in Germany. So that's the introductions over. I'll basically go to the ergonomics now, or not officially the ergonomics, but things like the safety and the handling. So the safety on the Lee-Enfield, I'll start with the safeties, which for some bizarre reason basically can be used whether the weapon is cocked or not. So I'll zoom in on that. The safety is basically a little lever on the left, which you can see here. It can be activated when the rifle is cocked or not. The bolt cannot be lifted when the safety is on. Can obviously when the safety is off. The same as when the weapon is cocked. It's on safe, it will not fire and the bolt will not operate. To decock the Enfield without actually firing it, just retract the bolt, squeeze the trigger, shove it home. The safety on the Mauser, although I can't actually demonstrate it on mine because it has a serious problem of being very stiff when it's in the rifle. Normally the safety will only work when the rifle is cocked. This rifle is a cock on open. We'll talk more about the bolts later, but essentially the cocking piece on the rear will open. When you lift the bolt, it retracts. Now the safety can normally only be worked when the rifle is cocked. The left position is the fire position, meaning that the rifle can be dry fired and operated. This is a wing safety. It essentially flips upright in the vertical position. This is the safe position. The bolt can still be operated, but the rifle cannot be fired. It also blocks you from looking down the sight, so it's easy to tell whether the rifle is unsafe or not. When it's in the far right position, the opposite of the left side, sticking out the right, that's known as the extreme safe position. The rifle cannot be fired and the bolt cannot be operated either, so it's a very, very safe position, essentially. The cocking pieces on both the rifles differ slightly in that the Lee-Enfield cocking piece can be manually retracted to the, or the striker itself can be gripped by the fingers and cocked. The Mauser, on the other hand, cannot, although it does have a physical indicator whether it's cocked or not. For example, at night you can tell with the Lee-Enfield whether it's cocked or not by feeling it. Same with the Mauser. This rear part will protrude out like you saw just now, and that is a physical and visual indicator on both the rifles that they are cocked. Moving on to the sights, the Lee-Enfield has a slightly longer sight radius, or quite a length longer than the Mauser 98k. The rear sight is a simple aperture on the No4 Mark I Star model. The Mark I itself has a adjustable ladder sight which basically flips up, but it also has this simple peep sight here. The ladder sight on the No4 Mark I and the Mark II is essentially the same, and it can be flipped up and adjusted from 200 to 2000 yards. Configuration for these is all in yards, of course. The sight on here has only two adjustments. It can be flipped 90 degrees backward. This reveals a slightly raised aperture for 600 yards plus. It has a little 600 on the bottom and a 300 on the underside of the first sight. So there's no completely accurate way to sight the rifle for certain distances, which is a little bit of a disadvantage in some situations, but it's not really a huge concern. The Mauser, on the other hand, has rather different sights. It has ramp sights which are capable of being adjusted from 200 to 2000 meters. These sights basically just slide on a ramp, much similar to the Mauser Nagant and the earlier Springfield 1903 rifles. You just squeeze this little part here and it has the numbers written in meters on the top of the sight. You slide it forward and it elevates the rear sight. So that's the sight there adjusted to 2000 meters. It's rather impractical to actually accurately engage a man-sized target at that distance, and it just can't really be done at all, but in theory that's how it's supposed to work. Compensates for the drop of the 8mm round used in the Mauser. The first setting is 100 meters, since it doesn't have any significant drop at that range. Both rifles, the front sights are similar, they're just a basic blade. The Enfield, however, does have sight protectors, same as the SMLE did. You basically put the little front sight post in the centre of the rear aperture, which is a ghost ring. On the Mauser, however, this example is a pre-1939 dated example, so it doesn't have the sight hood which was introduced in 1939. It would normally just be covering over, a bit like the Mosin sight hood is. Although it's not circular, it's kind of like an egg shape. It just pops over the top, and it reduces glare and makes it slightly easier to pick out targets. The only disadvantage with the Mauser in some situations is because the rear sight is basically a little V-notch. It's not a terribly precise sight for aiming at a distance. It's just a little V essentially. So for very small targets at distance, it's slightly harder to hit with a Mauser. Well, not necessarily hit, but just using the iron sights. You can see that the blade is quite a little bit wider on the Mauser than it is with the Lee-Enfield, which has a much finer post. The Enfield sights are protected from either side, but there was never any hooded variation to protect the sights. Now move on to the next thing, which is the barrels. The Lee-Enfield has a slightly longer barrel than the Mauser. It's 25 inches, whether the Mauser has a 23.6 inch barrel. There's hardly any noticeable difference in performance coming directly from the barrels, and both are very accurate rifles with the barrels they have. The No4 rifle has a slightly heavier barrel than the K98K. It's a tiny little bit thicker as well in the steel which it's constructed out of. And it's supposedly a free float barrel, although in reality a lot of them weren't actually free floating in the way that a free floating barrel was supposed to be to increase accuracy. It didn't always work in that way, but in theory it's supposed to make it more accurate. Now move on to the bolts, or the bolt action, and I'm going to move the camera around so you can see the action more clearly. Apologies for the no editing. my software hates me. So I'll talk about the action on both of the rifles. They're quite different, and this is one of the most interesting differences between the two rifles, are the way in which they operate. The Lee-Enfield, as you may or may not know, is what's known as a cock-on-close action. Upon closing, the striker is left off to the rear, which leaves it in the cock position. I'll demonstrate that now. Unlike with most rifles, which are typically a cock-on-open, they have a slightly angled cam surface, which the bolt housing pushes against, which angles the cocking piece and then clicks it over the sear. This works in a rather simpler way, to be honest. The bolt is simply lifted, and there is no pressure upon lifting the bolt. Easy to do. No pressure whatsoever. Pulls to the rear, also with no pressure. Pushing the bolt back forward, it will stop at this particular point. This is where the rifle begins to compress so the spring inside the bolt housing begins to compress. And then this portion will stay to the rear. It's a little hard to get on camera, but you'll see after it's done. This portion has stayed to the rear. Upon dry firing, it clicks in, and then the rifle will then discharge around. The action on the Enfield is very smooth and fast, particularly because of the cock-on closing feature. Now the Brits believe that that is what made it so fast, and that kind of design is what they stuck with. Also, the Pattern 14 rifle and the American M1917 model Enfield also had a cock-on closing action. It's considered a lot faster than a cock-on open. Well, not necessarily, but particularly the Mauser, it is a faster action. It is also a lot smoother and requires a lot less stress to operate in stressful conditions. A lot less effort to operate, should I say. It's very smooth backwards and forwards motion. It's also quite a tight tolerance bolt. Has quite little wobble, so it makes for a nice accurate shooter. The bolt itself has one locking lug, which is on the underside, you can see here. That fits into a little recess on the left side of the receiver when it's closed. It's a very smooth bolt and can be worked very quickly. There were stories in the First World War of the earlier SMLE rifle. The Germans thought they were being shot at by machine guns, when it was in fact dozens of troops armed with the Enfields firing at rates of about 30 to 40 rounds a minute, which is insane considering it's a bolt action rifle. And that's all accurately hitting targets 200 yards and sometimes further, so that's amazingly good. And as I showed you earlier, you can, because it catches on the sear, if you hold the trigger down, push the bolt forward, it will not catch, since the sear has moved down and out of the way of this portion of the bolt here. Now onto the Mauser bolt. The Mauser is rather different, and it's considered to have the best bolt action of almost any rifle ever produced. Now the reason this is often said is because of how safe it is to fire, and it has all these very well thought out features that make it a very functional and reliable and sturdy bolt action mechanism. It's the most copied out of all the bolt actions mechanisms, and it's still used in many of the highest quality military and sporting rifles to date. Complete opposite to the Lee-Enfield in the way it cocks, it is a cock-on open action, meaning that the firing pin and spring are compressed to the rear upon the opening of the bolt and not the forward closing motion like it is with the Lee-Enfield. So lifting up on the bolt is a bit difficult to do where I'm sat, but it still is rather smooth action. That moves the cocking piece to the rear. The bolt can then be opened, new round chambered. One of the interesting features of the Mauser is when the magazine is empty and the case is extracted from the chamber and ejected upon the last round, the bolt cannot be closed. This is a feature to let the rifleman know that he's out of ammunition. Whereas you have the rifle to your shoulder, you cannot always distinguish how much ammunition you have. And one of the problems you can have with the Lee-Enfield is if you're rapidly firing it and not counting your rounds, you may close the bolt with the rifle at your shoulder, go to fire another shot and you just get a click because there's no bolt hold open device. The Mauser was one of the first rifles to incorporate this. Of course there have been tons of rifles that have done that since. Pretty much all the assault rifles today have some sort of open bolt on the last round device. But this was a very useful feature. All it basically does is it just jumps up and touches the bottom face of the bolt so it can't be pushed forward. The way to close it is basically to push down on the floor plate and slide it back slightly, and then you can slide the bolt forward and over. Another reason the bolt was so favoured on the Mauser is for something called a controlled feed. Now I'll try and get you a good close-up on this. The controlled feed is another factor that makes the action so reliable. This, what you see on the side, is the extractor. Now the way this works is it grabs the rim of the cartridge. The rim of the cartridge slides underneath up onto the bolt face upon stripping it from the magazine. So instead of the Lee-Enfield, which pushes it into the chamber and then grabs it with the extractor, the Mauser does it as soon as it picks it up from the magazine. This makes it for a lot more reliable feed, and you can control the round as soon as it leaves, hence the designation or the name controlled feed. This helps to reduce the likelihood of a variety of issues. For example, if you got a round stuck in the chamber and the extractor wasn't round the rim, if you try to pull the bolt back, the round is still stuck and you're trying to pry it open trying to pull it out with your hands. It's not going to work too well. With the Mauser, you can just whack the bolt handle and it will eventually pull it out because it's got control from very early on. Another good thing with the Mauser is it has the strength to actually eject a round which still has the bullet in it. A lot of rifles will not have the strength to eject a round which is still loaded. Cases easily, but not if a round's necessarily still loaded. I'll try and demonstrate that now with a single round. If I place it under the extractor until it grips it, which is quite hard to do from where I'm sat, but I hope it works alright. So when I pull the bolt to the rear, it should, in theory, eject relatively easily. As you can see, it did. A lot of rifles will not have the strength to eject that, like I said. So the controlled feed allows for a lot of benefits in a way. The Mauser, also on the receiver, has a typical stripper clip guide to insert a stripper clip. I'll mention more on that on the ammunition section. Overall, the bolt design on the Mauser is very strong, and it has has a tiny bit of wobble when it's out of the receiver, and it's very reliable and will handle a huge amount of pressure. The Mauser bolt is particularly special as well because it has 3 lugs, which is until the Mauser came along was quite rare to actually see on one rifle. I'll just remove the bolt now and show you. The first 2 lugs are the typical lugs. They are located one left and one right. Now when the bolt is closed, obviously these lugs will rotate up into recesses and they won't come out if they're vertical. When they're on the left and right, they can be removed. It also has a 3rd lug on the bolt on the underside there, which there in the centre of the screen now. Now it provides for extra safety. Now a lot of people say you don't necessarily need a 3rd lug, which probably isn't true, but then it's extra safety. I mean, you can't really complain. Most rifles, however, like the Mauser K98K, which just have 2 frontal lugs, like it has on this bolt, they get by just fine. But extra safety, you can't complain, can you? So, upon closing the bolt, when the round is chambered, the extractor doesn't actually spring out. It just keeps hold. There's no actual spring device like the Lee-Enfield, which is slightly different. So upon closing the Mauser action, it depresses a small pin on the side of the bolt here, which is what allows you to rotate the housing down and keep the cocking housing in the same part. So there's a tiny bit of pressure closing that. And then simply, rifle fires like so. I forgot to mention that little bit about the extractor on the Enfield. I might as well just show you that now. The Enfield has a slightly different extractor in which it's just sat here. Now the spring in mine is actually missing because I dropped it by accident once and the spring went flying out somewhere. So apologies for that I can't actually show you the exact extractor action. But it's essentially this little piece here. Now what happens is there's a recess. When you push the bolt forward, it will cam against a little surface to the right of the chamber. So when you shut it, it will be forced outwards. Next time you open the bolt, it will come back down and grab a hold of the rim of the cartridge, and then when you pull it, it will eject. Both of these rifles have fixed ejectors. They don't actually protrude as a little pin out of the bolt face, say like an AR-15 rifle does of the current day. So they're a bit different in that respect. Well, thanks very much for watching part 1. I'll continue on in part 2, where I'll be discussing various other things like magazines, accuracy, weight, and the bayonets and the ammunition. So thanks for watching, please rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in part 2 hopefully. Thanks.